My son, I finally brought you a real woman. Those 7 words shattered 8 years of marriage in less than 10 seconds. Judith Pierce didn't whisper them. She didn't soften them. She stood in the middle of her son's living room, one hand resting confidently on her designer handbag, while the other gestured toward the young woman standing beside her. The woman smiled politely, almost as though she'd already been promised the life that belonged to someone else. Across the room, Savannah Pierce never moved. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply looked down at her wedding ring, the same ring Gavin had slipped onto her finger 8 years earlier when they were still struggling to afford rent, and quietly accepted every cruel word his mother had just thrown at her. Judith wasn't finished. She looked directly at Savannah before saying the words that would haunt everyone in that room. A wife who can't give my son a child isn't a wife. She's just taking up space. The room became painfully silent. Gavin stared at his mother, as though he no longer recognized the woman who had raised him. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment behind it was impossible to miss. "Mom, that's enough." But Judith refused to stop. She insisted that Gavin deserved someone younger, someone healthier, someone who could finally give the Pierce family the grandson she'd been demanding for nearly a decade. Then something unexpected happened. Savannah slowly reached into her purse. No one knew what she was doing. Not Gavin, not Judith, not the smiling stranger still standing beside the front door. She carefully placed a large, sealed envelope on the coffee table. Across the front, written in neat handwriting, were only 9 words. "Open only after you know the truth about me." She didn't explain what it meant. She didn't ask anyone to read it. Instead, she looked at Gavin with a heartbreaking smile that somehow carried 8 years of love, disappointment, exhaustion, and hope all at once. Then she quietly said, "If the day ever comes when everyone finally realizes who I really am, promise me you'll open it." Gavin frowned. He started reaching for the envelope. But before his fingers could touch it, Savannah gently placed her hand over his. Not today. Less than 24 hours later, the private plane carrying Gavin Pierce disappeared somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. Within hours, the news declared that no survivors had been found. Within 2 days, his own family threw Savannah out of the only home she'd ever called hers. And the envelope, the one no one bothered to open, held a secret powerful enough to destroy every lie they believed about her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The envelope remained exactly where Savannah had placed it. No one reached for it. It sat quietly on the coffee table, almost forgotten, while the silence inside the living room grew heavier with every passing second. Judith Pierce glanced at it before letting out a dismissive laugh. "Another performance?" she scoffed. "If she spent as much time trying to give you a child as she does trying to make people feel sorry for her, we wouldn't be standing here today." Savannah didn't answer. She had discovered something painful over the last 8 years. Some battles couldn't be won with words. Sometimes silence was the only shield a wounded heart had left. Gavin stepped forward until he was standing between his mother and his wife. His voice was calm, but every word carried quiet conviction. "I asked you to respect my marriage." Judith folded her arms. "And I came here to save your future. My future is standing behind me." For the first time since walking into the house, Judith had no reply. She looked toward the young woman she had brought with her. The woman suddenly looked uncomfortable. She quietly apologized, turned around, and slipped out the front door without saying another word. Judith's face tightened. "You'll regret this someday," she said coldly. "Love doesn't build a family. Children do." Gavin walked to the front door and held it open. "I think it's time for you to leave." For several long seconds, Judith simply stared at him. Perhaps she had expected him to hesitate. Perhaps she had expected him to choose his family's approval over the woman he had promised to love. Instead, he chose Savannah. Without another word, Judith picked up her purse and walked out. The front door closed behind her. The house became so quiet that even the ticking clock on the wall suddenly sounded loud. Gavin turned toward Savannah. "I'm sorry." She looked at him with gentle surprise. "You didn't do anything." "I know." His voice softened. "But every time someone hurts you because they're connected to me, it feels like I failed you." Savannah slowly reached for his hand. "You've never failed me." Those 4 words carried Gavin somewhere far away, back to the tiny one-bedroom apartment where their entire future had once fit inside 4 cracked walls. Back to the days when they counted coins on the kitchen table before deciding whether they could afford groceries or electricity. Back to mornings when Savannah woke before sunrise to work extra hours without ever complaining. There had been one winter evening Gavin would never forget. The landlord had knocked on their apartment door for the 3rd time that week. Rent was overdue. Again, after the landlord finally left, Gavin sat at the kitchen table in complete silence. He couldn't even bring himself to look at Savannah. "I'll figure something out," he whispered. She smiled as though she actually believed him. "I already know you will." The next morning, Gavin noticed something missing: Savannah's grandmother's necklace. She wore it every single day. It had been the only thing she owned that couldn't be replaced. When he asked about it, she simply smiled. It was time. Years later, long after success had found them, he accidentally discovered the truth. She had sold it that very morning to keep a roof over their heads. She never told him, not because she wanted recognition, because she never wanted him to carry the guilt. That was who Savannah had always been. She gave quietly. She loved completely. And she sacrificed without keeping score. The world looked at her and saw only one thing: a woman who hadn't given birth. Gavin looked at her and saw every dream that had survived because she refused to stop believing in him. Money had changed their address. It had changed the cars in their driveway. It had changed the people who suddenly wanted to be part of their lives. But it had never changed the reason Gavin loved her. She was still the woman who had believed in him when everyone else saw failure. Later that evening, after dinner had gone untouched, Gavin found Savannah standing alone in the backyard. The old wooden swing moved gently in the evening breeze. Years earlier, they had bought it together after laughing about the children who would someday fight over whose turn it was. Now, it simply swayed in the silence. "I still believe our day will come," Gavin said as he walked beside her. She kept watching the swing. "I wish believing was enough." It was the first time Gavin had ever heard hopelessness in her voice. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Then let me believe for both of us." Savannah rested her head against him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sometimes love wasn't measured by the promises people made. Sometimes it was measured by the promises they refused to stop believing. That night, after Gavin had fallen asleep, Savannah quietly walked into the living room. She picked up the envelope from the coffee table and held it against her chest. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out another folded document. She stared at it for a long time before whispering something no one else was there to hear. The next morning, she would ask Gavin to go with her to one final appointment. She had already made a decision, not to stop fighting for their dream of becoming parents, but to learn whether the truth they had been chasing for 8 long years was something neither of them had ever imagined. And what they would hear inside that doctor's office would change the direction of every life connected to the Pierce family. The next morning, Savannah and Gavin arrived at the fertility clinic before sunrise. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. After 8 years, there wasn't much left to say. They had driven this same route more times than either of them cared to remember. The same traffic lights, the same parking garage, the same waiting room filled with hopeful couples, quietly pretending not to notice one another. Only this time felt different. Savannah's purse rested on her lap, and inside it was the folded document Gavin had seen the night before. He wanted to ask about it, Twice, he almost did, but something in her expression told him she wasn't ready. Dr. Caroline Hayes welcomed them into her office with the familiar kindness that had kept them coming back over the years. She wasn't simply their physician anymore. She had witnessed every disappointment, every hopeful phone call, every painful silence. She sat across from them and opened their file. "I've reviewed every test we've ever run," she began, "including the latest results." Savannah slowly reached for Gavin's hand. It wasn't fear she felt anymore. It was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your soul after carrying unanswered prayers for too long. Dr. Hayes looked at them carefully before speaking again. "I know you've spent years believing someone in this marriage had a medical problem." She paused, "But that's not what your results show." Savannah lowered her eyes. "So, it's me anyway." "No." Dr. Hayes shook her head gently. "It isn't you." She turned another page. "It isn't Gavin either." For a moment, neither of them reacted. They simply stared at her. "Every test we've performed shows that both of you are healthy." The words hung in the room. Healthy. After everything, healthy. Savannah let out a quiet laugh that sounded more like heartbreak than relief. "So, after 8 years," she whispered, "the answer is that nobody knows why?" Dr. Hayes nodded, with honest regret. "I wish I had something more definitive to tell you. There are couples with completely normal medical evaluations who still struggle to conceive naturally. Medicine has advanced tremendously, but there are still questions we can't fully answer." Silence filled the office again. Not angry silence, not hopeless silence, just the heavy silence that comes when you've spent years searching for an explanation, only to discover there isn't one. As they stood to leave, Dr. Hayes stopped them. "There is one more option I'd like you to consider." She opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. "I didn't want to bring this up until I was certain we'd exhausted everything else." She slid it across the desk. Savannah looked down at the cover. Then she quietly placed it inside her purse without opening it. Gavin noticed. "What is it?" She forced a small smile. "I'll read it when we get home." Dr. Hayes didn't interrupt. She simply watched them leave, her expression thoughtful. Outside, the morning air felt unusually cool. They reached the car, but neither of them got in. Instead, they stood beside it, watching people hurry in and out of the hospital. Life seemed to be moving for everyone else. Gavin finally broke the silence. "If we never have children," Savannah looked at him, "would you still choose me?" He answered before she could even finish breathing. "I'd choose you in every lifetime." She smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that reminded him of the young woman who had once believed a tiny apartment could feel like a mansion if the right person lived there with her. He gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "I married you." He smiled. "I didn't marry the future we imagined." Tears filled Savannah's eyes, not because she was sad, because after years of carrying everyone else's expectations, she suddenly remembered what love actually sounded like. For the first time in months, hope returned, not because they had found an answer, but because they realized their marriage had never depended on one. 3 days later, Gavin received a phone call that could change his company's future. A last-minute opportunity, a private meeting in Denver with investors he'd been trying to reach for nearly 2 years. The flight would leave the following morning. "I'll be back before the weekend," he promised as he zipped his travel bag. Savannah nodded, trying to smile. "I know," but something inside her wouldn't settle. After Gavin went upstairs to finish packing, she reached into her purse and took out the folder Dr. Hayes had given her. She opened it for the very first time. As she read the first page, the color slowly drained from her face. Her hands began to tremble. She read it again, then a third time. By the time Gavin came back downstairs, the folder had already been tucked away. She never mentioned a single word she'd just read. Instead, she hugged him a little longer than usual, held his hand a little tighter, and watched him leave the next morning with a smile she didn't quite feel. She stood in the doorway long after his car disappeared around the corner. Somewhere deep inside, she felt that this goodbye was different. She couldn't explain why. She only knew that the unopened folder in her purse and the flight Gavin had just boarded were about to become connected in a way neither of them could have imagined. Savannah barely slept that night. The folder remained on her bedside table, unopened again, after she'd forced herself to close it. She didn't want to believe what she had read. She kept telling herself there had to be a mistake, that Dr. Caroline Hayes had simply wanted them to think about another path toward building a family. But one sentence refused to leave her mind. Before making any permanent decisions, we recommend repeating one final blood test. Recent hormone changes suggest a new evaluation is medically necessary. It wasn't a diagnosis. It wasn't a confirmation. It was simply a recommendation. Yet after 8 years of disappointment, even the smallest possibility felt too fragile to touch. She had decided not to tell Gavin until the new test confirmed something was truly different. She couldn't bear to watch hope rise again, only to be crushed one more time. So she kissed him goodbye that morning, carrying a secret she believed she would share in just a few days. She had no way of knowing those days would never come. By noon, Gavin's meeting had gone better than anyone expected. The investors loved his proposal. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine slowing down. Maybe taking a vacation. Maybe finally giving Savannah the quiet life she'd always deserved. As he left the conference room, he smiled when he saw her name on his phone. He answered immediately. "I was just about to call you." Her voice sounded lighter than it had in weeks. "I won't keep you. I just wanted to hear your voice." He leaned against the hallway window. "I'll be home before you know it." "I know." There was a pause. Then Savannah laughed softly. "You still owe me dinner." "I remember. And don't try taking me somewhere expensive." "I wasn't planning to. I want that little Italian place where we had our first anniversary. The one where we could only afford one dessert?" "The very one." Gavin smiled. "I'll see you in 2 days." "You'd better." Neither of them realized those would be the last words they would speak to each other for 7 months. The news alert appeared just after 6:40 that evening. A private aircraft traveling from Denver had disappeared from radar after severe weather moved unexpectedly across the mountains. Emergency crews were already searching. No survivors had been confirmed. Within minutes, every major news network was carrying the story. Savannah stared at the television without blinking. Her phone rang once. Then again. Business partners, friends, unknown numbers. She answered none of them. She simply sat down on the living room floor, clutching Gavin's sweater against her chest. The house felt impossibly quiet. She kept waiting for another update, another phone call, another headline saying there had been a mistake. Instead, the silence grew heavier. Outside, reporters began gathering near the entrance to the Pierce estate. Inside, time stopped. 3 days later, there was still no official confirmation. No survivors, no bodies, no answers, only speculation. The search had been suspended because of dangerous weather conditions. Everyone around Savannah slowly began speaking about Gavin in the past tense. She refused to, not once. When people said he was such a good man, she quietly corrected them. He is. When someone offered condolences, she simply thanked them. Deep inside, something refused to accept that their story had ended this way. Every night, she left the porch light on. Every morning, she looked toward the front gate before making coffee. She couldn't explain why. She just believed that somehow he would find his way home. On the 4th morning, Savannah woke feeling unusually dizzy. The room spun for several seconds before she caught herself against the bedroom wall. She remembered the note inside Dr. Hayes' folder, the blood test. Without telling anyone, she drove back to the clinic. Dr. Hayes looked surprised to see her. "I was hoping you'd come." The nurse drew another blood sample. Then the waiting began. It felt longer than 8 years. When Dr. Hayes finally returned, she wasn't holding Savannah's medical file. She was holding a small smile. "I checked the results twice," she said quietly, "and then I checked them a third time." Savannah's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear her own breathing. Dr. Hayes reached across the desk and gently took her hand. "Savannah, you are pregnant." The words didn't feel real. She stared at the doctor without speaking. After everything, after every negative test, after every prayer whispered into empty rooms, she couldn't make herself believe it. Tears slowly filled her eyes. "Are you certain?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "I've never been more certain." Savannah covered her face with both hands. The first person she wanted to tell was the one person the world insisted she had already lost. She rested a trembling hand against her stomach. Then she whispered through tears, "You have a good father." As Savannah drove home with the test results resting on the passenger seat beside her, she had no idea that another conversation was already taking place inside the Pierce family home. A conversation that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with ownership. By the time she pulled into the driveway, people she had once called family had already decided that neither she nor the child growing inside her belonged there anymore. Savannah sat in her car for several minutes after pulling into the driveway. The test results rested on the passenger seat beside her. Every few seconds, she glanced at the folder just to make sure the words hadn't somehow changed. Positive. After 8 years, after countless doctor's appointments, after prayers whispered through tears, she was finally going to be a mother. Her hands instinctively rested over her stomach. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile. She imagined Gavin standing in the kitchen. She imagined placing the test results in his hands. She imagined the look on his face. Then reality returned. The seat beside her was empty. The world still believed her husband was gone. She took a slow breath, wiped her tears, and stepped out of the car. Before she reached the front door, she noticed something unusual. Several unfamiliar vehicles were parked outside the house. The front gate stood open. The front door was already unlocked. A knot formed in her stomach. As she walked inside, the sound of quiet conversation drifted through the hallway. When she entered the living room, every voice stopped. Judith Pierce sat calmly in Gavin's favorite chair. Mallory stood beside her. 3 of Gavin's uncles occupied the sofa as though they had gathered for a business meeting instead of a family tragedy. No one offered Savannah a seat. No one asked how she was holding up. No one even acknowledged the tears still lingering in her eyes. Judith folded her hands neatly in her lap. "We've been waiting for you." Savannah looked around the room. "What is all this?" One of the uncles cleared his throat. "Since Gavin is presumed deceased, there are certain family matters that must be handled." The words struck her like ice. "Presumed," she repeated quietly, "so no one actually knows." Another uncle avoided her eyes. "It's only a matter of time." Savannah straightened her shoulders. "As long as there isn't proof, I'm not discussing my husband in the past tense." Judith's expression hardened. "Whether you accept it or not, life moves on." "No," Savannah answered softly. "People move on. Love doesn't." The room fell silent. For just a moment, Judith looked almost unsettled. Then her face became unreadable again. She reached into her handbag and removed a set of documents. "We're here to make this transition easier for everyone." She slid the papers across the coffee table. Savannah didn't touch them. "What transition?" "The house." Judith spoke as though discussing the weather. "The company vehicles. The financial accounts. The family believes it's best if everything returns to the Pierce estate until the legal matters are settled." Savannah stared at her. "You mean until you take everything?" One uncle shifted uncomfortably. Another looked away. Judith didn't blink. "You have no children." The words landed with quiet cruelty. "Our family line must be protected." Savannah instinctively placed a hand over her stomach. A movement so small, no one in the room noticed. If they had, everything that followed might have unfolded differently. She looked at the faces surrounding her. These were the same people who had celebrated holidays in this house, the same people who had smiled at anniversary dinners, the same people who had praised Gavin after his business became successful. Now they looked at her as though she were nothing more than an obstacle. Finally, Savannah spoke. "I helped build this life." Judith shook her head. "You lived in it." The distinction cut deeper than shouting ever could. Savannah remembered the tiny apartment, the overdue rent, the necklace she had quietly sold, the nights she had gone to bed hungry so Gavin could eat before another 14-hour workday. No one in this room had been there. No one. Yet somehow they had convinced themselves she deserved nothing. She slowly bent down, picked up the folder containing her pregnancy results, and held it tightly against her chest. For one brief moment, she almost told them. She almost said the words, "I'm carrying Gavin's child." But something stopped her. She looked into Judith's eyes and saw no grief, only calculation. If they could treat her this way, believing she was alone, what would they do if they knew there was an heir? The thought chilled her. She quietly closed the folder again. "I won't argue with any of you today." She turned toward the staircase. "I need time." Judith's voice stopped her halfway up. "You have until tomorrow." Savannah turned slowly. "For what?" "To leave." The single word echoed through the house. Mallory finally spoke. "We've already contacted new security." One uncle added quietly, "It will be less painful if you cooperate." Savannah looked around the room one final time. Not one person defended her. Not one. She nodded once. Then she walked upstairs. When the bedroom door closed behind her, the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally came. She sat on the edge of the bed, placed one hand over her stomach, and whispered through trembling lips, "It's you and me now." Outside the bedroom window, evening slowly settled over the estate. Downstairs, Judith believed she had already won. She had no idea that hundreds of miles away, inside a hospital where no one knew the name Gavin Pierce, a man opened his eyes for the very first time since the crash, and the first word he struggled to say wasn't help or doctor. It was his wife's name. The first thing Gavin noticed was the sound, a steady, rhythmic beeping somewhere beside him. Then came the bright white lights above his bed. He tried to move, but every muscle in his body protested. His throat felt dry. His head pounded. For several long seconds, he couldn't remember where he was or why. A nurse looked up from her chart and froze. Her eyes widened before she hurried toward the hallway. "Doctor," she called. "He's awake." Within moments, the room filled with quiet voices. A physician gently checked his pupils before offering a reassuring smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Pierce." Gavin frowned. "What happened?" "You were involved in an aircraft accident." Fragments returned like broken pieces of glass. The airport, the meeting, the storm, viol turbulence. Then, nothing. He swallowed painfully. "My wife." The doctor rested a comforting hand on the side of the bed. "Let's take things one step at a time." Gavin shook his head. "My wife." The doctor hesitated. "You've been unconscious for 7 months." The room became impossibly still. 7 months. The words echoed through his mind. They couldn't be real. 7 months earlier, he had kissed Savannah goodbye and promised to be home before the weekend. Now, an entire season had passed without him. He reached for the bedside table. "My phone." The nurse handed it to him after charging it. It powered on slowly. Hundreds of missed calls, thousands of unread messages, news alerts, business emails, condolences. His heart raced as he searched for Savannah's name. He pressed the call button. The call failed. He tried again. Then, a recorded voice quietly answered. "The number you are trying to reach is no longer in service." His stomach tightened. He tried their home phone. Nothing. He tried Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. the housekeeper, disconnected. Walter Jenkins, unavailable. Every failed call felt heavier than the last. He looked at the doctor. I have to go home. You've only been awake for a few hours. I've already lost 7 months. There was no arguing with that. 3 days later, Gavin was discharged. His body was weaker than he wanted to admit. Walking across the hospital parking lot felt strangely unfamiliar. The world had continued without him. New buildings, different advertisements, even the trees seemed taller. Everything had changed, except the one thought that had never left him. Find Savannah. The gates of the Pierce estate opened automatically. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. He was finally home. But the feeling disappeared almost immediately. 2 unfamiliar security guards stood near the entrance. Neither recognized him. One stepped forward cautiously. Can I help you, sir? Gavin stared at him. I live here. The guard looked confused. I'm sorry. Who are you? Before Gavin could answer, the front door opened. Judith appeared. The color drained from her face. For one long heartbeat, mother and son simply stared at each other. Then Judith rushed toward him. Gavin. She wrapped her arms around him, crying. Everyone else might have believed the tears. Gavin knew his mother well enough to notice something else. Fear. Real fear. Not because he had survived, because he had returned unexpectedly. Mallory hurried into the foyer moments later. She looked just as shocked. You're alive. Gavin gently stepped away. Where's Savannah? Neither woman answered. He noticed the hesitation immediately. The glance they exchanged lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Something was wrong. He asked again, Where's my wife? Judith slowly lowered herself onto the sofa, as though the conversation physically exhausted her. Gavin. She sighed. There are things you need to prepare yourself for. His heartbeat quickened. What happened? Judith looked down at her hands. For a while after the accident, she was devastated. A pause. We all were. Another pause. But grief changes people. Gavin said nothing. She told us she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. Every word landed like a stone. She packed her things. Another pause. And she left. He stared at his mother. Left? Judith nodded sadly. We tried to stop her. Mallory quietly added. She said she needed a fresh start. Gavin's eyes never left his mother's face. What about the house? Judith answered too quickly. We handled everything while you were gone. Too quickly. Too smoothly. As though the explanation had been rehearsed. He slowly looked around the room. Something felt different. The family photographs had been rearranged. Savannah's favorite paintings were gone. Even the fresh flowers she always kept near the staircase had disappeared. The house no longer felt like their home. It felt staged. He walked into the kitchen. The coffee mugs Savannah loved were missing. The recipe book she kept beside the counter. Gone. The small herb garden she'd planted outside the window. Dead. 1,000 tiny details. Individually meaningless. Together, they told a story. Someone hadn't simply watched Savannah leave. Someone had erased her. He returned to the living room. When did she leave? Judith hesitated. A few weeks after the accident. What did she take? Mallory answered. Just a few personal things. Again. Too quickly. Too perfectly. Gavin looked from his sister to his mother and back again. Then he asked the one question neither of them expected. Where's Walter? The room fell silent. The old security supervisor, Gavin continued. He would have seen her leave. Judith looked away. He retired. Mrs. Eleanor? The housekeeper resigned. Abdul? The gate guard? Mallory swallowed. He moved. 3 people. Gone. Every single one who could have witnessed what really happened. Gavin didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply nodded. I understand. But he didn't. Not yet. Because deep inside, The same instinct that had helped him build a successful business was whispering something he couldn't ignore. People could lie, details rarely did, and every detail inside that house was telling him the same thing. Savannah hadn't abandoned him. Someone wanted him to believe she had. The following morning, before speaking to another member of his family, Gavin drove straight to the headquarters of his company. There was only one person left who had been loyal to him long before success and who had never learned how to lie. By the end of that meeting, Gavin would hear the truth for the very first time. And once he did, there would be no turning back. Gavin barely slept that night. The questions kept circling through his mind. Why had every longtime employee suddenly disappeared? Why did the house feel as though Savannah had never lived there? And why had his mother answered every question, except the ones that mattered? By sunrise, he had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to search for answers inside his family. He was going to find someone who had nothing to gain by lying. The first person he called was the company's human resources director. I need the personnel files for every household employee who worked at my home before the accident. The director sounded surprised. They're archived, sir. I'll wait. Less than an hour later, Gavin sat alone in his office with a stack of files spread across his desk. One name immediately caught his attention: Walter Jenkins, the longtime security supervisor. Unlike everyone else, Walter had listed a forwarding address after leaving his position. Gavin didn't hesitate. He got into his car and drove there himself. Walter opened the front door slowly. For a brief second, he simply stared. Then his eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Pierce." Gavin smiled faintly. "It's good to see you, too." Walter shook his head in disbelief. "They said." "I know what they said." He took a slow breath. "I need the truth." Walter looked over his shoulder before stepping aside. "Please, come in." The small house was modest but warm, nothing like the Pierce estate. Yet somehow it felt more honest. Walter sat quietly for a moment, struggling to find the right words. Finally, he looked Gavin in the eye. "Your wife never left you." Gavin felt his chest tighten. "I knew it. The day after everyone believed you died." Walter continued. "Your mother arrived with your sister and several relatives." He described everything: the documents, the demands, the threats, the order for Savannah to leave the house. They took her bank cards. They changed the security codes. They dismissed every employee who tried to help her. Gavin closed his eyes. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. Walter's voice softened. She walked out carrying one suitcase. Nothing else. Gavin swallowed hard, and no one stopped it. "I tried." Walter lowered his head. "So did Mrs. Brooks. But your mother told us if we interfered, we'd lose our jobs." Silence settled over the room. Walter finally looked up again. "There's something else." Gavin slowly opened his eyes. "What?" Walter smiled for the first time. "Mrs. Savannah is pregnant." The word stole the air from the room. For several seconds, Gavin couldn't speak. He simply stared. "Pregnant?" Walter nodded. "She's nearly 7 months along." A laugh escaped Gavin. Before, tears followed. He covered his face with both hands. All those years, all those prayers, all those disappointments. And somehow, the miracle had happened. He had become a father without even knowing it. When did she find out? A few days after the accident. Walter reached into a drawer and removed a folded photograph. "I thought you should have this." It was an ultrasound picture. Savannah had written something across the bottom in blue ink. "Your daddy is already the best man I know." Gavin held the picture as though it might disappear. He traced the tiny words with his thumb. Then he whispered, "I'm coming home." Walter gave him one final address. "She rents a small apartment 3 blocks from the old Delver Street Market. Every morning she sells homemade breakfast outside the subway entrance." Gavin frowned. "Sells breakfast?" Walter nodded. "She said she wasn't looking for charity. She only wanted honest work. Those words sounded exactly like Savannah. She had never asked life for easy roads, only the strength to keep walking. The next morning, long before sunrise, Gavin parked half a block away. He didn't want to interrupt. He simply wanted to see her. The city was just beginning to wake. Streetlights still glowed softly against the gray morning sky. A handful of commuters hurried toward the subway. Then he saw her. She stood behind a small folding table, wearing a simple apron, her hair tied back neatly. Her pregnancy was impossible to miss now. Yet, despite everything she'd lost, she greeted every customer with the same gentle kindness she'd always carried. A little boy handed her a few crumpled dollar bills. She smiled. "Keep your money." She slipped an extra breakfast sandwich into his bag. "Tell your grandma this one's on me." The boy grinned and ran off. Gavin felt tears sting his eyes. Success had never changed her. Hardship hadn't changed her either. She was still Savannah, the woman he'd fallen in love with. As though sensing someone watching her, Savannah looked up. Their eyes met. The smile on her face disappeared. The paper cup she had been holding slipped from her fingers and rolled across the sidewalk. For one impossible moment, neither of them moved. She blinked once. Then again, as if she no longer trusted her own eyes. Gavin. His name came out as little more than a whisper. He crossed the distance between them without saying a word. When he finally reached her, he stopped just long enough to gently place one trembling hand against her cheek. "I'm late," he whispered. "I'm so late." The tears Savannah had held back for 7 long months finally broke free. "You came back. I never stopped trying." Carefully, he wrapped his arms around her, protecting both her and the baby growing between them. The busy sidewalk around them seemed to disappear. Nothing else existed. Not the traffic. Not the morning rush. Not the months they had lost. Only the two people who had spent 8 years fighting for a future and had almost lost each other before they could finally become a family. As they stood there holding one another, Savannah remembered something she had hidden away on the night Judith humiliated her. The sealed envelope. She had carried it with her ever since leaving the Pierce estate. She looked up at Gavin through tear-filled eyes. "I think," she whispered, "it's finally time for you to know the truth." Gavin looked at the envelope in her hands. He remembered the promise he'd made months earlier. To wait. Neither of them realized that what was inside that envelope wouldn't just expose Judith's lies. It would reveal a truth about Savannah that no one, not even Gavin, had ever imagined. And that truth would change the Pierce family forever. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city faded into the background as Savannah reached into her bag and carefully removed the same sealed envelope she had placed on the coffee table months earlier. The edges were slightly worn now. It had traveled everywhere with her, through lonely nights, through doctor's appointments, through mornings spent standing behind a small folding table before sunrise. She ran her fingers gently across the front. The handwriting was still there. "Open only after you know the truth about me." She looked at Gavin. "I never thought you'd actually have to read it." His hands trembled as he accepted it. "I almost opened it that day." "I know, but you asked me to wait." She nodded. "Because if you had opened it before everything happened, you would have spent the rest of your life trying to prove something to people who had already decided they would never believe me." Gavin slowly broke the seal. Inside were several neatly folded pages. The first wasn't a letter. It was a timeline. Every fertility appointment, every medical report, every prescription, every specialist they had visited over 8 long years. Each document was dated, organized, carefully labeled. Beneath them lay copies of every test result Dr. Caroline Hayes had ever given them. Across the final report, one sentence had been highlighted. "Neither patient shows evidence of infertility. Both have healthy reproductive profiles." Gavin looked up. "I don't understand." Savannah smiled sadly. Keep reading. The next page was written in her own handwriting. My dearest Gavin, if you're reading this, it means something happened that I never wanted to happen. I know there will be people who blame me for the years we waited. Some already do. But I need you to know something. I never measured our marriage by the child we didn't have. I measured it by every morning we chose each other, by every struggle we survived together, by every dream we built when we had nothing. If one day your family tells you I wasn't enough, don't waste your energy proving them wrong. Love doesn't need permission from people who never understood it. You once told me that I believed in you before anyone else did. The truth is, believing in you was never difficult. You were always worth believing in. If life ever separates us, promise me only one thing. Don't let bitterness become your inheritance. Choose peace, because that's the greatest gift we can leave our children. Forever yours, Savannah. By the time Gavin reached the final line, tears blurred the page. He looked at the woman standing in front of him. You wrote this before the crash. She nodded. That night, your mother brought another woman into our home. You thought we'd lose everything. I thought I might lose you. He gently folded the letter. No, he smiled through tears. You made sure I found my way back. 2 days later, Gavin asked Judith to meet him at the Pierce estate. She arrived believing her son had finally softened. Instead, she found the entire family gathered in the living room. Mallory, the uncles, the family elders, even Mrs. Eleanor Brooks and Walter Jenkins had been invited. Judith looked around the room uneasily. What is all this? Gavin stood beside Savannah. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He simply placed the contents of the envelope on the table. Every medical record, every doctor's report, every letter. Then he spoke. For 8 years, my wife carried blame that never belonged to her. No one interrupted. You judged her. You humiliated her. You treated her as though her worth depended on giving this family a child. He paused. The truth is, he rested his hand over Savannah's. There was never anyone to blame. The room remained silent. Gavin turned toward his mother. When you believed I was gone, you threw the woman who stood beside me when I had nothing out of our home. Walter quietly stepped forward. I witnessed it. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks nodded. So did I. The uncles slowly lowered their eyes. For the first time, no one defended Judith. She looked at Savannah, really looked at her, not as the woman she had spent years criticizing, but as the woman who had loved her son through poverty, through uncertainty, through success, and through loss. Judith's voice barely rose above a whisper. I can never undo what I did. No, Savannah answered gently. You can't. Tears filled Judith's eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. Savannah was quiet for a long moment. Then she stepped forward. You know what hurt the most? Judith slowly shook her head. It wasn't losing the house. It wasn't losing the money. It wasn't even the insults. She placed a hand over her stomach. It was realizing that the moment your son needed his family the most, his family forgot how to love. Those words settled over the room with more weight than any accusation. Judith covered her face as she quietly cried, not because someone had finally exposed her, but because, for the first time, she saw herself clearly. A month later, Gavin and Savannah welcomed a healthy baby boy into the world. When the nurse placed him in Gavin's arms, he laughed and cried at the same time. You kept your promise, he whispered to Savannah. She smiled. So did you. Outside the hospital room, Judith stood quietly in the hallway. She hadn't assumed she would be invited inside. She simply wanted to know they were safe. After a few moments, the door opened. It was Gavin. He stepped into the hallway. Without saying a word, he handed her a single photograph. It showed Savannah smiling from her hospital bed while their son slept peacefully in her arms. On the back, Savannah had written one short sentence. every family deserves the chance to become better than yesterday. Judith held the picture against her heart as tears rolled down her cheeks. She knew trust would not return overnight. Some wounds needed time. Some scars never disappeared. But she also understood something she had spent years refusing to believe. A family's legacy isn't carried by its name. It's carried by the way it chooses to love. And in the end, that was the inheritance Gavin and Savannah chose to leave their son. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to tell us in the comments. Do you think Savannah made the right choice by showing Judith grace? Or would you have walked away for good? We'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy powerful stories about love, betrayal, family, and unforgettable second chances, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember this: the strongest families aren't built by blood alone. They're built by loyalty, sacrifice, and love that refuses to give up.